Ruth John had always believed that love, the real kind, the kind that burrowed deep into your chest and made it hard to breathe, was quiet. Not loud or flashy. It didn't need grand gestures or 1,000 roses. Sometimes, it was just sitting next to someone in the campus library, sharing silence, feeling seen. That's what it was like with Mason Lane. They met during freshman orientation. Ruth had arrived late, flustered, juggling her bag, water bottle, and a lopsided folder full of forms. She slipped on a piece of paper in the hallway and nearly crashed into the guy in front of her. Mason had turned around, laughed, and said, "Well, if falling for someone was this literal, I'd say we're off to a strong start." Ruth blushed hard, her mouth full of apologies. He picked up her papers, helped her to her feet, and walked her to the auditorium like they were already friends. They became friends, fast. Study sessions, movie nights, inside jokes. Ruth knew he liked mint-flavored gum, never wore socks that matched, and had a scar on his shoulder from a childhood biking accident. She memorized the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking hard and how he bit his lip just before he smiled. But she never told him she loved him, not once. She convinced herself that being by his side was enough. That friendship was a kind of love, too. And then came Rose. Rose White walked into Ruth's life like a lightning strike, bold, beautiful, and impossible to ignore. They'd been paired on a sociology group project in their sophomore year, and despite being from very different worlds, they clicked. Rose was loud where Ruth was quiet. She wore confidence like perfume, thick and intoxicating. Her laugh turned heads. Her makeup was always flawless. She didn't just enter a room, she arrived. At first, Ruth loved that about her. She introduced Rose to Mason thinking nothing would change. Why would it? Mason was her person, her safe place. But Mason noticed Rose, and Rose noticed him right back. At first, it was innocent. Ruth kept telling herself that. A joke shared between Mason and Rose here. A longer than usual hug there. Group study sessions that slowly turned into Mason and Rose texting without her. Ruth would lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling of her dorm room, phone clutched to her chest, wondering if she was being paranoid. She'd scroll through Mason's social media, noticing how often Rose appeared in his posts now. She'd think about all the things Mason used to only do with her, the late-night walks, the coffee runs, the Sunday study marathons, and how Rose now occupied that space. Still, she said nothing. She smiled when Rose mentioned how funny Mason was. Laughed along when Mason told a story that Ruth had already heard a dozen times. She kept it all buried, tight-lipped and aching. One afternoon, it all became too real. Ruth walked into the campus cafe, the one where she and Mason always studied together, and there they were, Mason and Rose, sitting close in a booth, heads leaned in, whispering and smiling like they shared some secret language. Rose's hand was on Mason's arm. Ruth froze, her chest tightening. She turned and left before either of them could see her, the tears already threatening to spill. Later that evening, Rose called her. "You okay?" Rose asked, voice sweet but casual. "You kinda ghosted me today." "I just had something to do," Ruth lied. There was a pause. "Hey, can I tell you something?" Ruth felt it coming. Her hands trembled. "I think I like Mason," Rose said softly. I didn't mean for it to happen. But I think he likes me too." Ruth closed her eyes. That was the moment everything shifted. Not because Rose liked Mason, but because Mason didn't say no. Ruth stared at her phone long after Rose hung up. Her hand was still holding it, frozen in place like it weighed 100 pounds. "I think I like Mason." The words echoed, rang, burned. She replayed that call over and over in her mind. The way Rose said it, almost tender, almost guilty, like she knew. Like she understood the landmine she'd just stepped on, but stepped anyway. But what haunted Ruth most wasn't Rose's words. It was Mason's silence. He hadn't told Rose he wasn't interested. He hadn't reminded her he was Ruth's best friend. He hadn't done anything to stop it. And that silence felt louder than a confession. The next morning, Ruth avoided the usual bench in front of the literature building, the one where Mason would sit and wait for her after her 10 a.m. class. She took the back way through the quad, hoping to escape unseen, but fate had other plans. Ruth, she froze. That voice warm, familiar, disarming. Mason, she turned around slowly. He jogged up to her, smiling like nothing had changed. Like the world wasn't upside down. "You've been MIA, he said, brushing a strand of her hair off her shoulder in the casual way he always did. "Everything good?" There it was. His usual charm. The closeness that once gave her butterflies. Now it made her nauseous. "I've been busy," she said, forcing a small smile. He tilted his head, searching her face. "You sure?" Ruth nodded too fast. "Yeah. Of course." He hesitated, then stepped back. "Okay. But hey, Rose said you left the cafe yesterday. Were you mad or something?" There it was again, Rose. Like her name now came before Ruth's in his mouth. Like she'd slipped into the spot Ruth had carefully guarded for 2 years. "No," Ruth said, voice low. "I just had something to do." Mason studied her, but didn't press. Maybe he sensed the shift, maybe he didn't care. Either way, Ruth couldn't breathe until he left. That night, Rose came over with a tub of ice cream and a guilty smile. "Truce?" Ruth didn't respond. "Look," Rose said, sitting on Ruth's bed, "I didn't mean to fall for him. I really didn't. But he's amazing, Ruth. You know that." "Yes. I know that. I've always known that. And I swear, if you're not okay with it, if it makes things weird, I'll back off." Ruth stared at her, torn between pain and pride. She could see it in Rose's eyes. She wanted Ruth to say no, to give her an easy out, but Ruth also saw something else, the gleam of hope. "The kind you can't fake." "You like him," Ruth said, more a statement than a question. Rose nodded slowly, and Ruth, in that moment, lied to protect what little of her heart was left. "It's fine," she whispered. "Go ahead." For the next few weeks, Ruth became a ghost in her own world. She watched as Mason and Rose bloomed like a spring that came too early. He started walking her to class. They sat close in the cafeteria. His laughter became louder, but less familiar. And the worst part, they still included Ruth, invited her to hang out, messaged her in the group chat, waved at her across campus. Like nothing was wrong. Like she hadn't been the bridge that led them to each other and then got trampled on. At night, Ruth lay awake, wondering why she said it was okay. Was it because she wanted to be the bigger person? Or because she was afraid if she said no, she'd lose both of them completely? One rainy evening, Ruth walked past the art studio and saw them through the window. Mason was sketching something he once only did around her. Rose was curled up beside him, laughing, her hand on his thigh. Ruth turned away, heart in pieces, and whispered to herself, "I loved him first," and the silence answered, "But he chose her." By mid-semester, Ruth had mastered the art of pretending. She could laugh in the right places, nod when someone mentioned Mason and Rose, and smile when the couple entered a room. She had perfected the balance between being visible enough not to seem bitter and quiet enough to keep her pain undetected. Everyone assumed she was fine. After all, Ruth had never dated Mason. She was just a friend. But no one knew the nights they spent lying on the campus lawn watching stars. The little poems he texted her randomly, the way he called her his safe space. No one knew how she memorized the rhythm of his voice like a favorite song. Or how many times she imagined her name in his mouth, not as a friend, but as something more. Now, she watched as he gave all of that to Rose. One afternoon, during creative writing class, their professor assigned an essay titled "What You'll Never Say Out Loud." Ruth blinked at the prompt, her pen trembling as she gripped it. Her classmates were already scribbling furiously. She hesitated, then began to write. I loved him when he didn't see it. I loved him through your laughter, your attention, and your silence. I loved him while pretending not to, while helping you fall for him, while watching him fall for you. I loved him like a secret I buried alive. And now I wake up every day mourning a future that never even got a chance. She stopped writing. Her hand had gone numb. She stared at the words, raw and bleeding on paper, and quickly tore the page out, folding it into quarters. She wouldn't turn it in. Some truths didn't belong to classrooms. That evening, Ruth found herself at the library, her old comfort place. She sat in their usual spot, the far back corner where no one really went. She hadn't been there in weeks. As she unpacked her books, a shadow appeared beside her. She looked up. Mason, didn't think I'd find you here, he said, sliding into the chair across from her. She shrugged. He looked at her for a long second, then leaned forward. Are we okay? Ruth blinked. What do you mean? You've been distant. Different, because I've been watching you give my place to someone else. Because I'm grieving you without ever having had you. Because you chose her. I'm just tired, Ruth said softly. Midterms. Mason nodded, but didn't buy it. I miss you. Ruth's heart clenched. You have Rose. That doesn't mean I don't miss you, he said. You're still important to me, Ruth. She swallowed hard. I know. They sat in silence. The kind that once used to be warm. Now, it felt cold. Like two people trying to find the past in a place that no longer fit them. After a while, he stood. Let's not lose this, okay? She nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah. Sure. But as she watched him walk away, she realized something painful. They already had. That weekend, Ruth received an invitation. Rose's 21st birthday party. The text was chipper, casual. Hey love. Big party Friday. Mason's planning most of it. Hope you'll come. Mason's planning it. Of course he was. Ruth stared at the screen for a long time. She debated deleting the message. She debated saying she was sick, busy, anything. But instead, she said yes, because part of her still hoped for something. Not for love. She wasn't foolish enough anymore. But maybe closure. Maybe peace. Maybe a final goodbye to the version of her that still clung to a maybe. Friday came, and the party was everything Ruth expected. Loud music, lights, drinks, people spilling out onto the lawn. Rose sparkled in a silver dress. She looked stunning. Mason was by her side the entire night, beaming, proudly holding her waist. Ruth kept her distance, sipping punch and trying to disappear in plain sight, until Mason saw her. He walked over, smiling. You came. She shrugged. Would have been rude not to. They stood close, but not close enough. Hey, he said after a pause. Come outside for a second? She hesitated, but nodded. They stepped into the night, away from the noise. The cool air bit at her skin. I'm glad you came, Mason said quietly. We haven't had a real moment in a while. Ruth looked at him, his face so familiar, and finally whispered, Mason. Do you ever wonder if things could have been different? He frowned. Different how? If I had told you earlier. If I'd said something. He stared at her, confused for a moment. And then it clicked. Ruth, I loved you, she said, finally, voice shaking. Before her. Long before. I just never told you. The silence that followed stretched miles. I didn't know, Mason said slowly. You never. I mean, you were always there, but I didn't think. You weren't supposed to think. I was supposed to tell you. I just didn't. Mason looked torn. But I love Rose now. I know, Ruth said. That's the thing. I know. And just like that, the air between them shattered. After that night, Ruth couldn't sleep. Not because she regretted telling Mason the truth, but because now there was no undoing it. She had said the words aloud. I loved you, and he had replied, but I love Rose now. There was no accusation in his voice. No confusion. Just quiet certainty. It was over before it ever began. But still, Ruth's heart didn't know how to grieve something that never had a proper life. The next morning, the group chat was buzzing with birthday pictures. Everyone raved about the party, Mason's playlist, Rose's dress. Ruth didn't open a single image. She couldn't. Instead, she scrolled to the Notes app on her phone and opened a new page. Unsaid things. I still remember your handwriting from the first class we took. I waited for you to notice me, even when I laughed too hard at your jokes. I hated when she called you babe. Not because I hated her, but because I used to call you Mace, and I thought that meant something. She paused, fingers trembling, and then typed one last line. I think a part of me will always wait for you. Then she closed the note and locked her phone, as if that could lock the feeling away too. On campus, the changes were subtle but sharp. Mason and Ruth no longer shared their old spots. No more library sessions. No more spontaneous late-night texts. Their messages grew shorter. Polite. Dry. Rose didn't say much either, but Ruth could feel the distance creeping in. It was as though the truth had left a crack in everything, and they were all pretending it wasn't there. During a group presentation, Ruth and Mason had to sit beside each other. As he leaned over to hand her the laptop, their fingers brushed briefly. She flinched. So did he. Neither of them said a word. One rainy afternoon, Ruth walked into the common room and found Rose curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Hey, Rose said, trying to sound cheerful. You've been quiet lately. Just tired, Ruth replied, dropping her bag beside her. Is this about the party? Ruth blinked, cautious. What do you mean? I mean, Rose hesitated. I saw you and Mason talking outside. I know something happened. Ruth's stomach dropped. Did he tell you? Ruth asked. Rose shook her head. No. He just looked different afterward. Like something was heavy on him. Ruth sat down. I told him the truth. That I loved him. Rose's expression faltered, but she masked it quickly. I figured. Silence settled between them, tense and uncomfortable. I didn't plan any of this, Ruth, Rose said softly. I swear, if I knew. You didn't do anything wrong, Ruth interrupted. Neither of you did, but you're hurting, Rose said. And I can't fix that. No, Ruth whispered, voice barely holding together. You can't. That night, Mason sent Ruth a message. I've been thinking about what you said. She stared at it for a long time. Her thumbs hovered over the keyboard. She could write so many things. Or nothing at all. Eventually, she typed, you don't need to. It's done. And then, after a beat, but thank you for letting me love you in peace, even if you never knew. He didn't reply. A few days later, Ruth sat alone under the big oak tree near the art building, the one she and Mason used to sit beneath every Thursday after class. The sky was moody, cloud heavy. She watched a couple walk by, laughing, their hands tangled. It wasn't fair, she thought. That someone else got to be the ending to a story you started. That someone else wore the smile you once imagined for yourself. But it was real. And sometimes, the reality of love was not in being chosen, but in learning to walk away with dignity, even when your heart stayed behind. By the time spring rolled in, the campus was blooming. So was Mason and Rose. They were now official, not just by rumor but by confirmation. Photos, couple tags, cheesy captions. They walked around like the golden pair of the university. Everyone admired them. People called them perfect. Ruth learned how to scroll past their pictures without flinching. How to nod when classmates talked about relationship goals. How to carry her sadness like a secret stone in her pocket, always there, always heavy, never shown. She'd made a vow to herself, don't break in public. One day, as she left the lecture hall, Ruth overheard a group of girls chatting behind her. Did you see the new reel they posted? Ugh, they're so cute. I want a Mason too. Rose is literally the luckiest girl on campus. Ruth quickened her pace, her ears ringing. That name Mason, once whispered in her mind like a poem, now felt like a stab. She didn't blame them. They didn't know. No one knew. Ruth buried herself in schoolwork. She joined a poetry club, started tutoring underclassmen, spent weekends at the art gallery alone. Anywhere she could avoid running into them or worse, pretending it didn't still hurt. One evening, as she was shelving books at the library where she worked part-time, a familiar voice stopped her. "Didn't think you still worked here." Ruth turned. "Mason." "Of course." She gave a polite smile. "Still need to pay rent." He chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I came to return something," he said, holding up a copy of Catcher in the Rye. Ruth nodded and reached out to take it, their fingers brushing again, brief, electric, wrong. "How are you?" he asked. She paused. "Busy." "Focused." "You?" Mason hesitated. "Good." "Rose is good." He said it like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to be happy or apologetic. "That's nice," Ruth said, forcing herself to sound genuine. There was a silence between them, full of words neither wanted to say. Finally, Mason cleared his throat. "Do you remember that night we stayed up arguing about whether fate was real?" Ruth blinked. "You said fate was just an excuse for people who didn't know how to choose." He smiled faintly. "You said it was real. That some connections happen whether we want them to or not." "I did," she said softly. They stood in that moment like they were back in freshman year, before Rose, before everything. "But you chose," Ruth added after a pause. "Didn't you?" Mason nodded slowly. "I did," and there it was again, the confirmation. The truth. The reminder. Ruth looked away. "I need to get back to work." "Of course," he said, stepping back. "I just know I miss talking to you." She looked up. "You don't get to have both." That landed hard. He blinked, nodded slightly, and turned to walk away. That night, Ruth sat at her desk and opened a new page in her journal. "You miss talking to me. But I miss being yours, even though I never was. And that's not the same thing." She shut the book gently and looked out the window. Meanwhile, across campus, Rose was laughing in Mason's arms under a tree Ruth used to call theirs. She saw them the next morning. Mason's hoodie on Rose's shoulders. Her makeup smudged from a night of fun. Mason whispering something that made her blush and look away. They didn't see Ruth, but Ruth saw everything. Later that week, Ruth passed Rose in the hallway. Rose stopped her. "Hey, you okay?" Ruth tilted her head. "You keep asking that," Rose sighed. "Because I keep wondering if we're still us." "Are we?" Ruth asked. "Because I don't know who us is anymore." Rose bit her lip. "I didn't mean to come between you two." "You didn't," Ruth said firmly. "There was no between. Just me." And silence. Rose looked like she wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. Ruth stepped around her and kept walking. Some friendships end in fire. Others, like this one, simply fade like fog in the morning sun, quietly, invisibly, until all you're left with is the ache of something that used to be. Ruth had always believed that healing came in stages: grief, acceptance, growth. But college had taught her something different. Sometimes, healing isn't a straight road. Sometimes, it's circular. You think you've moved on, and then something brings it all crashing back. Like the university's annual spring festival. She hadn't planned to go. Crowds weren't her thing anymore, especially when the two people she used to orbit around would be shining at the center of it. But her roommate begged her. "Come on, Ruth. You've been inside too much. It's just one night." Ruth relented. The campus was lit up with string lights and music. Food trucks lined the sidewalks. Laughter rang through the air like bells. She wore her favorite denim jacket, the one Mason once said made her look artsy in a dangerous kind of way. Funny how even jackets held memories. She spotted them almost immediately, Mason and Rose, dancing near the main stage, surrounded by friends. Rose had flowers in her hair. Mason spun her around and caught her like a scene from a romantic movie. Ruth turned away. Ruth, too late. Mason had seen her. He broke away from the crowd, jogging toward her. You came, he said breathlessly, as if her being there mattered more than it should. Didn't expect to run into you so fast, she said, trying to sound light. You look good, he said. She did. She knew it. But it didn't feel like enough. Thanks. They stood awkwardly as the music swelled behind them. Do you want to talk? He asked. Shouldn't you get back to Rose? She's with her friends. We've got time. There it was again, that space he kept offering her. Half doors. Half feelings. She should have walked away. But she didn't. They ended up by the lake at the edge of campus. Quiet. Calm. Mason skipped a stone across the surface. Do you still write? He asked. Every day. I miss reading your poems. You were never supposed to read half of them. I know, he said with a small laugh. But the ones you let me read, they stuck. Ruth looked out at the water. Why are you here, Mason? He hesitated. I guess I hate how things ended between us. They didn't end, she said. They faded. You faded? Mason's voice softened. That's not fair. It is, she said. You made a choice, Mason. And I made peace with it. But you don't get to keep showing up like you left something behind. Silence. I didn't mean to hurt you, he whispered. I know, but I did. She turned to him. You didn't just hurt me. You erased me. Slowly. Quietly. I watched you fall in love with my best friend like I was background noise. Mason looked at her with something close to shame. Ruth stepped back. We were friends. Best friends. I gave you everything but the words. And maybe that was my mistake. But yours was acting like I didn't matter. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't wait. Ruth walked away from him that night, not because she hated him, but because she finally loved herself more than the maybe he kept offering. Back in her dorm, she opened her notebook again. Some loves aren't lost. They're returned to the shelf you once picked them from, unfinished, unclaimed, but no longer yours to carry. She drew a small heart beside it, not broken, just closed. The next day, Rose approached her in the library. Can we talk? Ruth looked up. She nodded. They stepped outside, by the fountain. I know Mason talked to you last night, Rose said. Ruth stayed quiet. I saw you two by the lake. I didn't interrupt. I figured. Maybe you needed closure. I did, Ruth replied. Rose looked uncertain. And? Did you get it? I think so. A pause. I know it's messy, Rose whispered. What happened between the three of us? It's not just messy, Ruth said gently. It's complicated. But life is complicated. Rose's voice cracked a little. I never meant to take him from you. Ruth shook her head. You didn't. He was never mine, but he could have been if I hadn't. If he was meant for me, nothing you did would have stopped it, Ruth said calmly. And if he was that easy to lose, then maybe I was never truly chosen. They both stood there for a while, two girls, once best friends, now strangers bonded by the same man. Rose finally asked, Can we still be us? Ruth smiled sadly. Maybe someday. But not today. Weeks passed. The warmth of spring gave way to the buzz of finals. Campus grew quieter, students disappearing into libraries and study halls. Ruth liked it that way. Silence, for once, didn't hurt. She no longer flinched when she heard Mason's name. It still echoed in corners of her mind, sure, but now it didn't sting. It just existed. Like an old song you no longer cried to. Healing, she realized, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't big speeches or sudden closure. It was small things: waking up without thinking of him, walking past Rose without aching, seeing a photo of them without losing her appetite. It was waking up one day and realizing she hadn't thought of him at all the day before. One afternoon, as she cleaned out her dorm room, she found a shoebox under her bed. Inside were memories she'd hidden away. The first bracelet Mason gave her when they won a debate together. A napkin from the campus cafe with his sketch of a flower and the words "You deserve beauty." A Polaroid of the three of them: Mason, Ruth, Rose's arms linked, laughing like the world wasn't capable of falling apart. She sat on her bed, box in her lap, and let herself feel it one last time, not to cry, not to mourn, just to remember. Then, she sealed the box and slid it to the back of her closet. Not everything needs to be thrown away. Some things just need to be put in their proper place. During her final literature class of the semester, the professor read a quote. Sometimes we have to lose something to understand what we were really meant to find. It lingered in the air. Ruth looked out the window and smiled softly. She didn't feel lost anymore. That weekend, the university hosted a farewell gathering for graduating seniors. Though she was just a junior, Ruth volunteered to help organize. It kept her busy and gave her something to focus on that wasn't heartache. While stringing fairy lights across the event tent, she heard a voice behind her. "You always did like making things beautiful." She turned. Mason. He looked a little older now, tired eyes, hair messier than usual, but still Mason. She didn't smile. But she didn't frown either. "I like helping people feel celebrated," she said. He nodded, hands in his pockets. "You look happy." "I am." Mason seemed to struggle with what to say next. I wanted to thank you for telling me the truth. That night by the lake, I didn't do it for you, I know. But it helped me see things. About who I was. About how blind I'd been." Ruth studied him. "You loved Rose. I'm not angry you chose her, Mason." His brows pulled together. "Then what are you angry about?" She paused. "That you didn't even consider me. That I was right there, beside you, for years, and you never once looked at me the way I looked at you." Mason looked down, silent. Ruth continued, "I don't need you to apologize. I just needed you to know." "I do," he said finally. "And for what it's worth, I miss who we were." She gave a faint smile. "We were never really we. Just almost. And almost hurts more than never." As he walked away, she didn't feel the familiar sting of heartbreak. She felt peace. Some people are not meant to stay. They're meant to teach you something. And Mason had taught her that love without choice is just longing. That staying silent about your feelings doesn't make you stronger, it only builds a cage around your heart. The next morning, Ruth sat on the library lawn, her journal in hand. She wrote, "This is not a love story. It's a story about love, about how sometimes the person you love teaches you how to love yourself more, about letting go of the door you kept knocking on, even when no one ever answered, and maybe, just maybe that's enough." Rose had everything she thought she wanted. Mason Lane, smart, charming, talented. The guy who could make any room feel warmer, any silence feel safe. And yet, months into their relationship, something began to shift. It started small, like the way Mason sometimes drifted off mid-conversation, or how he grew quiet whenever Ruth's name came up even in passing. He no longer said it easily, like it hurt, or like it carried a weight he couldn't drop. At first, Rose ignored it. They were just settling into each other, right? But then she noticed how often he scrolled through old photos, the ones with Ruth in them. How he paused when they passed the library. How he stopped sketching like he used to when Ruth used to sit across from him, cheering him on without needing to say a word. Rose wasn't stupid. She knew what it meant. One evening, she asked him directly. "Mason," she said, "are you happy?" They were lying on her dorm floor, surrounded by books and empty coffee cups. He looked at her. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one." He hesitated. "Yeah. Yeah. Don't lie," she said softly. Mason sat up, ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you want me to say." "I want you to say you've stopped thinking about her." The room went still. He didn't deny it. Instead, he stared at the floor like it had all the answers he didn't. "I love you, Rose," he said eventually. "But," Mason looked up, pain in his eyes. "But I think I didn't realize how much Ruth meant to me until I lost her." Rose stood, arms crossed. "So what am I? A placeholder?" "No," he said quickly. "You're not. I chose you. I do love you, but you think about her. I miss her, he admitted. Not because I want to change what we have, but because I think I never really gave myself the chance to understand what she was to me. Rose's heart twisted. And if she told you earlier? Before I did? Mason didn't answer. That said more than enough. Meanwhile, Ruth had started to breathe easier. She had poured her energy into something new, herself. New books. A summer writing internship. Daily walks. Journaling not about him, but about her. Her dreams. Her voice. Her place in the world outside someone else's shadow. But even in growth, there were echoes. She still thought about them sometimes. Wondered if they laughed together the same way he once laughed with her. If he ever told Rose the things he once told Ruth in hushed tones between classes and quiet spaces. Then one day, something unexpected happened. She received a message. Hey, can we talk? Rose. Ruth stared at it for minutes before replying. Talk about what? About everything. About Mason. About us. She debated ignoring it. But something inside her, a flicker of curiosity, or maybe just closure, replied. Tomorrow. Cafe by the Science Building. 3 p.m. The next day, Ruth walked into the cafe to find Rose already seated, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She looked different, less polished, more real. I wasn't sure you'd come, Rose said. I wasn't sure I would either, Ruth replied. There was a silence between them, thick with memory. I need to ask you something, Rose said quietly. Do you still love him? Ruth blinked, surprised by the directness. I think a part of me always will, she admitted. But not the same way. Rose nodded slowly. He's different lately. Distant. Like his heart somewhere else. Ruth didn't respond. I think, Rose continued, he's realizing too late what he had with you. Ruth looked at her, steady. But he chose you, Rose. And you chose him. That matters, does it? Rose asked, her voice breaking. If he's still chasing something he lost, there it was, the crack in their perfect world, the illusion unraveling. You don't owe me answers, Ruth said calmly. But if you're asking me to say it's okay to walk away, then yes. It is. Rose's eyes filled. I didn't think it would hurt this much to win. That night, Ruth journaled again. Sometimes the one who wins ends up lonelier than the one who lost, because real love isn't about who got chosen. It's about who stayed when no one was choosing. She looked out at the night sky and realized something important. For the first time in a long time, she didn't wish to go back. Mason couldn't sleep anymore. Nights stretched like film over old wounds, and every quiet moment echoed with the sound of a voice that no longer called him. Ruth's voice. Soft, patient, full of quiet strength. He had everything he said he wanted: Rose, attention, love wrapped in photos, and public approval, but something wasn't right. Something hadn't been right since that night by the lake. He had chosen Rose. But a part of him had always wondered, did I choose too fast? Or did I just ignore what was real because it didn't come wrapped in fireworks? With Ruth, there had never been pressure. Just peace. With Rose, everything was loud. Beautiful, yes. But chaotic. Lately, even Rose noticed the shift. They'd been fighting more. She grew distant, started hesitating before holding his hand in public. They'd spend time together but feel miles apart. One evening, Rose looked at him across her dorm room and said what neither of them wanted to admit. I think we're running out of magic. Mason didn't argue, because deep down, he knew it wasn't magic they lacked. It was meaning. The next morning, he walked alone to the library, not looking for books but for Ruth. He hadn't spoken to her in weeks. He didn't even know if she would want to see him again. But there was something he needed to say. She wasn't there. Instead, he saw her name on a poster taped to the wall. Poetry reading featuring student writer Ruth John, Friday at 6 p.m. His heart thudded. He hadn't known she was writing publicly now. That night, he went. He didn't sit close. He stood at the back of the small campus lounge, hands in his pockets, hidden in the crowd. When Ruth stepped up to the mic, she looked different, glowing, not because of her outfit or makeup, but because of her presence. She looked free. She cleared her throat, opened her journal, and read. This poem is for the almosts, the almost lovers, the almost friends, the people who held our hands but dropped our hearts. You were my favorite sentence, but I was just a bookmark in your story. Still, I read you like a prayer, softly, secretly, hoping one day you'd understand the weight of my silence. The room was still. Mason stood there, shattered in a way he hadn't expected. That was him. He was the almost. The one who didn't see her until it was too late. He left before the applause. Ruth didn't notice him in the crowd, but when she got back to her dorm, there was a note slid under her door, her name in familiar handwriting. You were always more than almost. I was just too blind to see it. She stared at it for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't rush to reply. She folded it once, placed it inside her journal, and whispered to herself, I was never the almost. He just wasn't the ending. The next day, Ruth sat with her mentor professor who had been reading her poems throughout the semester. You're good, the professor said. Really good. You should apply to the summer writing program in New York. Ruth blinked. New York? Full scholarship. 3 months. You've got the voice. You just need the stage. It was sudden. Scary, but it felt right. A fresh start. Meanwhile, Rose sat across from Mason one final time. She wore no makeup. Her hair was tied up. Her face was tired, but clear. I'm letting you go, she said softly. He swallowed. Because of Ruth? Because you never really belonged to me, she replied. And I deserve someone who does. He nodded, not in anger, not in protest, just understanding. Some truths didn't need explanation. That evening, Mason walked past the oak tree he and Ruth once sat under. He sat there alone, replaying every moment he hadn't noticed, every chance he hadn't taken. He pulled out his phone, typed a message, then deleted it. Some things, he realized, don't need reopening. Some doors are better closed gently, with gratitude. In her dorm, Ruth sat at her desk filling out the application for New York. A future? Finally, not built around someone else, but hers. She looked out the window and smiled. The campus was quieter now. Graduation loomed for some. Summer plans buzzed for others. But for Ruth, it wasn't just a new season, it was a new life forming, one that didn't orbit around anyone else's gravity but her own. The acceptance email had come at 3:42 a.m. Congratulations! You've been selected for the NYU Summer Writers Fellowship. She'd sat in bed, hand over her mouth, blinking back tears not because of Mason or Rose or the past but because for the first time, she wasn't waiting for someone to choose her. She had chosen herself. On her last day before flying out, Ruth walked across campus one final time. She passed all the old landmarks. The bench where she and Mason once sat in the rain, drenched and laughing like kids. The cafe where Rose had confessed her feelings. The fountain where she once asked herself if she'd ever stop hurting. She passed them all not like someone looking back, but like someone finally walking forward. Mason saw her from a distance. He had heard she was leaving. Word got around fast. He stood across the quad, frozen in the same place he once waited for her after class. This time, she wasn't rushing into his arms, or shyly smiling like she wanted more. She was walking with purpose, suitcase in hand, sunlight on her shoulders, and the wind behind her. He wanted to call out to her. He didn't. He knew now this wasn't his chapter anymore. Ruth reached the campus gates, paused, and turned around one last time. Not to look for Mason, not for nostalgia, just to smile. Because she had survived it. All of it, the quiet heartbreak, the unspoken love, the betrayal, the ache, the letting go, and she was still here. More than that, she was whole. On the flight to New York, Ruth opened her notebook and wrote the final lines of a poem that had taken her nearly 2 years to finish. He didn't choose me, but I did, and maybe that's the only happy ending I ever needed. She closed the book, leaned back in her seat, and exhaled deeply. She was no longer the girl who loved in silence, no longer the friend who stood second in line. She was the main character now, and her story was just beginning.